Welcome to our Hard Truths, Fair and Equal Housing virtual event. And thank you to URL Media for teaming up with us on this event. I'm Erica Pandy, business reporter at Axios, and I'm coming to you from Hoboken, New Jersey. I want to welcome our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. You can join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and #Axios events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by Javier David and S. Mitra Kalita of URL Media. We'll dig into the challenges of affordable and fair housing and explore what policy solutions could help bridge that racial homeownership gap. Our first guest is Secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary Marcia Fudge, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being here, Secretary.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So we know that housing is essential for our mental and physical health, for our children's well-being, for building generational family wealth. But we also know that good, affordable housing is far from accessible for everyone in this country. You've got this 30,000-foot view of the state of homes and neighborhoods in our country. I'd love to know, what are the hard truths that keep you up at night, that motivate you to do what you do?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you today. The things that keep me up at night certainly are ensuring that every single person in this country has a fair shot to live in a decent and safe home in a decent and safe neighborhood. And so today, what we're talking about from a HUD perspective is announcing an opportunity for us to help low-income people and our residents who are rarely ever really the focus of wealth building. And that's one of the ways that we can make sure that they get a fair chance by creating an environment in which we can help them build their credit, save resources to maybe do home ownership, but for whatever they choose, get the financial kind of counseling that they need, and to help them to really start to build a platform by which they can build wealth. And we're doing it coupling it with about $113 million in resources that can be applied for by not just public entities, but for the first time, privately owned multifamily housing landlords. And so we're excited about trying to make sure that every single person in this country can get their piece of the American dream, and that's home ownership.
So I want to dig into all of the different ways you're attacking this problem that you're announcing today, because there's so many facets of it. But going back a little bit, I mean, some of the stats that I was talking with your team about, the Black and white home ownership gap is wider today than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act became law. And today, the median white family holds 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Latino family. So there is a strong racial gap here, and I can't believe that it's grown. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think probably you or your friends, everyone today is talking about the rising cost of housing, whether it be rental or home buyers. We're looking at interest rates that have gone up. What we are seeing is a crisis, not just in home ownership, but a crisis in this country as to who can afford to live in certain neighborhoods. Today, I probably could not afford to buy a house in the neighborhood I grew up in. That's how much the market has changed. And so since we are looking at everything through a lens of equity, and we're looking at how we address the systemic racism that has permeated the federal government, quite frankly, for generations and generations, we're using these kinds of opportunities to assist people who have historically been left out, who have historically been underserved, and they are in those numbers that you quoted us just a few seconds ago. We want to help them get out of that situation by providing them an opportunity to better themselves in their situation. And that's what we're trying to do with this today.
So you've got a big plan laid out, calling it bridging the gap here, and there's sort of lots of facets to how you're doing this. There's credit building, there's helping folks save. Obviously you had to think about this before you went ahead with this plan. What are some of the biggest challenges folks face right now, beyond just the soaring price of homes, when it comes to renting or buying good, affordable housing?
Let me just also say to you, Erica, we're also looking at those who already own homes. We know because of racism and bias, people like me who own their own home and happen to live in a Black or brown community, and I happen to live in an all Black community, find our housing undervalued on the market. And so we lose wealth annually because in a Black neighborhood, our homes are generally undervalued by almost half if you live in an all Black or an all Black brown neighborhood. So we're looking at current housing and how we can keep people in a position to build wealth and pass something on to the next generation, but as well as give those who have never had an opportunity, never believed that they could be in a position, to give them an opportunity to better their lives. We know in our family sufficiency program this year, those who are already in the program, most of them will end this year with somewhere around $9,500. That is a huge amount of savings for someone who is poor or someone who is having great difficulty just making ends meet every day. And so we're giving people the resources to take a chance on their futures. And that's what this is all about.
Take me behind that $113 million push that you just mentioned. What is that money going to see the effects of that in this country?
Primarily, the money is going to go to provide personnel, for the most part, to our grantees or our awardees so that they can bring in the kind of resources that are necessary, whether it be in someone to come in and teach them about banking, maybe it's someone who would come in and help them do budgeting. But we're going to see it because in the long run, they're going to finally understand how to start to build wealth. The other thing we're going to do is make sure that we assist young people in building wealth. We know that in most public housing agencies and even in some multifamily, once a child reaches 18, we start to consider their income as a part of the household income. But we know because of the cost of housing, young people cannot afford to move out of their parents' homes or their families' homes for sometimes long periods of time. So we're going to allow them to build wealth separate and apart from the household wealth that we are working on as well. So we see a win-win for people who are just trying to make it. And we think that this is going to be a real opportunity, a jumpstart, as it were, to get people moving toward bettering their lives. We're going to make sure that if people pay their rent on time, if they have an FHA assured mortgage, we're going to look at that as a part of their credit record. Today, you could pay your rent every single month perfectly on time and get no credit for doing it. And then we will say, you have no credit history. Well, we're changing that as well. So we are doing everything in our power to make sure that every single person we serve gets an opportunity to find a path towards either home ownership or towards saving or building their credit.
And I want to go back just a second because I forgot to ask you about this. So if you're living in a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood, you find your home is, grossly undervalued. How do you even go about fixing that problem? How are you trying to tackle that piece of it?
Well, we have a report that we issued in March. It's called PAVE. It's a Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity. And what we have done in that report is made very clear and shine a very bright light on the fact that there is bias in the appraisal system. It is a system that is, I think the number is 97% white. And so there is an inherent bias. And I always use myself as an example, Erica. I live in an all Black neighborhood, but I live 2 doors from an all white neighborhood. My home is bigger. My lot is bigger than the house 2 doors from me. My home is valued at $25,000 less than the home 2 doors from me. So I'm losing $25,000 in valuation annually. But what we have said in this report, this PAVE report, is now you can challenge that evaluation. You can challenge it. You can request another one from a different entity that we have to take a look at, or have them come back and reevaluate based on the circumstances. Because what we know is that some of the formulas are biased in and of themselves. So now the industry is looking at how they value properties. They're trying to become more inclusive and more diverse. They're also looking at the formulas they use. So we have made already a tremendous impact by just saying to them, take a look at what is happening and make it right. And they're trying to do just that.
So much of this, it seems like, is educating folks on what your options are, how you get there. And you've got this new plan, you're tackling this through credit building, through savings, through education, all of the above. We've got just under a minute left. I'd love to hear what's the next big thing on your docket.
Let me say, Erica, the one thing that people have said for many, many generations is knowledge is power. The better prepared, the better educated, the better informed people are, the better decisions they make about their lives. It's like we used to say, if people would do better if they knew better. Our job right now is to make sure that they know better, that they know the options, that they can understand how to move in an upward direction. The things that we're working on are we're going to continue to talk about equity. We're going to continue to talk about closing that home ownership gap. And we're going to make sure that everybody understands that at HUD, fair housing is the law of the land. And we're going to support it in every single way we can.
Secretary Fudge, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And next, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Javier E. David.
Thanks, Erica. Our next guest is New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell, joining us today from New Orleans. Welcome, Mayor Cantrell.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Just wanted to ask, start out by asking, two of the biggest post-pandemic trends have included a lack of affordable housing and a boom in remote work, and both are interconnected and play a role in spurring migration to and from major cities. And they've had a sizable impact on how affordable housing is or isn't in any particular city. What is your administration doing to make renting and owning more affordable in the city while making New Orleans more hospitable in general?
Sure. So the issue of affordable housing in the city of New Orleans was an issue for us, a challenge, a crisis for us before the pandemic. The impacts of the pandemic, of course, exacerbated the problem, but the need has been there. The focus on affordable housing and quality affordable housing has been a priority, a top priority of mine, and understanding that still the majority of the residents of the city of New Orleans are renters still. And so the focus on this issue for me dates back to my tenure as a city council member, pushing for a real housing plan, one that we could have a pipeline of units that we could depend on. But now as mayor, I have really been able to lift up this work and working with all partners, of course, my Office of Community Development, but more importantly, the Housing Authority of New Orleans, as well as the Finance Authority of New Orleans and our New Orleans Redevelopment Authority, you name it, all hands are on deck to leverage the resources for affordability. We created we call it the Equitable Path Forward program, which one, it accomplishes a couple of things. We have HENO produced a 2016 assessment of fair housing plan to, again, kind of create that pipeline. But as mayor, I've just kind of focused on lifting it up. One that focuses on overcoming those patterns of segregation, really fostering inclusive communities, and to combat just discrimination, and one that makes the impacts of these types of policies and stigma that it gets to your folks, and really trying to give us a direct path out of that. Also speaks to the mandatory inclusionary zoning policy that kind of grew out of this work that I spoke of about the Equitable Path Forward. So the mandatory inclusionary zoning policy was published and released, and maps establishing sub-districts where these rules would apply, and partnering with our local developers and being very strategic about that. But this was a landmark change to the city's zoning code that really requires developers to build affordable housing units in neighborhoods with some of the highest housing costs in the city. And so my administration has allocated over about $54 million for affordable housing developments throughout the city since 2018, but being very, again, strategic with partnering with the developer community, and providing these resources that you have to provide in order to create permanent affordable housing in areas, again, throughout the city with the highest housing costs. So we have been able to create like win-wins with, one, creating housing in these areas that are high, dry areas, because, you know, we're on the front lines of climate change as well. So when we think about affordable housing, we want to make sure that we're putting people in places that are safe as well in terms of flood mitigation practices and just being on that front line. We continue to leverage both local, state, and federal dollars to, again, work with these developers to be very strategic in creating affordability. We were also among the first communities in the nation you mentioned the COVID-19, but to stand up resources to help renters throughout our city who lost income, experienced hardship, of course, were in imminent danger of being homeless as well. So we were able to expend over $57 million in rental assistance to help stabilize our households that have lost this income, and provided rental assistance and utility assistance to over 17,000 households as well. So while we helped with rent, we also took and went deeper with utility assistance because there's a need there. And because of these practices, we were able to receive additional direct allocations from Treasury, because we were one of the municipalities that were able to get this money out of the door sooner rather than later, where we saw even at the state level, the state was unable to get money out of the door. And so we were able to kind of dip into those resources as well. We also found ourselves winners of an eviction diversion program, an award at the federal level by HUD as being one of the first cities in the state, really, in Louisiana, but in the country, to have a eviction diversion program where we really help keep people in homes. We also help the landlord community in terms of paying for arrears as far back as a year in arrears, and really now 2 years because we've been in this pandemic that long. So we've been, you know, doing a lot with leveraging housing tax credits as well, housing vouchers, that speaks to our housing authority and HUD's ability, you know, to advance our projects and kind of create and build a pipeline of projects. So there's so many different layers of work that we're doing on the ground, but I'll kind of be quiet there for you to ask me more questions.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Housing NOLA released a blueprint called Housing for All, which asked basically for $37 billion in investment to sort of address a lot of what you just laid out. So what is the city doing specifically to sort of support some or all of these objectives that this organization laid out?
Well, I mean, the city is we created and is funding a real pipeline where at one point, you know, the resources would not be available, or resources would be available, but the developers weren't necessarily shovel ready. So we kind of streamlined and pivoted or turned the map around a little bit with making sure that we allocated money. One example, 7.5 million to 5 developers and organizations that were shovel ready. So instead of, you know, allocating money where the developer wasn't ready, it's like, no, we're not abandoning projects that are in the pipeline, but if they're not ready, we're going to only go to those that are ready. And so the notice of funding available grant that was awarded to 5 developers really resulted in 256 units now coming down the pipeline as a result of this process. So just being very intentional about the awards that go out, but making sure that those awards are given to developers that are ready. and not, oh, I think I may be ready, but no, every indication is that they are. And then we were able to, in that process, build up our small development community or developer community by giving some of them a real shake and an opportunity to do and advance affordable housing in this city. And that took us away from only looking at large scale developers that could do the work. So this has resulted in building up not only our pipeline, but giving small developers an opportunity to not only develop housing, but to make their mark in the city that they live in. And of course, making sure that minorities and Black and brown folks get a fair shot, at participating in these development opportunities. Also, as it relates to, we find affordability is also in owner-occupied properties, also ensuring that we're focusing on doubles in our community. So you may have or be an owner occupied, but have a double that needs maintenance. So we found that allowing for our homeowners to receive resources to maintain and improve their properties actually keeps or allows for these more units to be online, but more, not just affordability, but quality units online.
So Cantrell, we're actually
good.
out of time, but thank you for that. We're actually out of time, but thank you very much for joining us on this very important topic and this very important discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for focusing on it as well.
And next, over to URL Media CEO and co-founder S. Mitra Kalita for the next segment.
Thanks, Javier. I'm S. Mitra Kalita, the CEO of URL Media and the publisher and CEO of Epicenter NYC. Our final guest is the president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, Lisa Rice, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Mitra. How are you?
Great. I'm great. I'm so glad you're with us. So I'm going to dive right in. And Lisa, you have eloquently and repeatedly said where you live matters, from credit scores to good schools to whether you have access to groceries or transit, this idea of your address being so definitive. So over the last few years, this idea of home, I think we've really seen redefined. There's bidding wars and kind of no supply in the real estate market. I mean, you've seen the characterization. So I want to begin with a basic but fairly broad question, which is homeownership still the best path to fair and affordable housing?
Well, yes, it is. Even though we're dealing with a housing affordability crisis, we're lacking about 4 million affordable units. But we're still finding that home ownership is the most important wealth builder. It is the #1 way that families and people build wealth in this country. And so having a scenario where people don't have access to affordable home ownership is it can be quite debilitating for families, and it really doesn't bode well for our nation's future.
So just, I kind of painted a picture of one aspect of housing over the last few years. I really feel like the last few years have defined by what I call the 3 Ps, right? The pandemic, the president, as in a new one with President Biden, and the protests after the death of George Floyd. And each of those have massive implication for housing policy. So I just wanted you to paint how the pandemic has gone from a fair housing perspective. If you could just take us kind of coming out of where we've been to then look at where we're going.
Well, coming out of the pandemic, we saw, first of all, how health and housing were so intertwined because of the pandemic. You had to remain stably housed in order for us to get past the pandemic. And so we work to help ensure that people could be able to do that. And we really pushed Congress to pass a number of provisions in the COVID packages that would result in secure and housing stability for families. And that included the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that included funds to help families who were impoverished, the child care tax credit, and things like that. It included, for the first time in our nation's history, the Homeowners Assistance Fund. So all of those things we saw helped families to remain stably housed. It helped to ensure that the economy was secured. And it also helped us to get past the pandemic as well as we could, right? All other things considered. So post-pandemic, what we are seeing is that we haven't done enough to shore up the ability of everyday Americans, hardworking families, to be able to purchase and secure affordable housing units. We need about 4 million affordable units. We have been underproducing affordable housing units since the Great Recession. And we used to really think of this, Mitra, as a coastal problem, but we're now seeing a shortage of housing in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota and Wyoming and Ohio, because quite frankly, during the pandemic, people found out that they could live anywhere. Many people, not everyone, but many people could move to places that they thought were more affordable and still maintain their jobs and work remotely. So that has caused a lot of pressures that we are seeing, supply chain disruptions that we're still experiencing, restrictive zoning ordinances in these new places where people are moving, competition. We have an increase in competition from corporate investors. We're still dealing with issues like redlining and a lack of effective fair housing enforcement. All of those things have worked together, Mitra, to dramatically drive up housing costs. So we're seeing housing costs in the home ownership space increase by about 18%. And in the rental space, housing has increased 18%. So this is a major driver of inflation. And so that's the key issue that we're dealing with now. Affordability is really in crisis mode.
Yeah, I think this national picture you paint is really, really important because you mentioned a number of places in the Midwest. Is there any lessons that I know you've worked at, for example, in Ohio? Are there any quick lessons to impart from how the Midwest is dealing with an affordable housing crisis compared to decades of the problem, in more coastal areas?
No, Mitra, and in fact, we've launched a new initiative. It's called the Keys Unlock Dreams Initiative, to try and work with municipalities throughout the nation on this housing affordability crisis, as well as the growing racial homeownership gap. And what we're finding is that no jurisdiction really has the right solution, A, and B, jurisdictions are dealing with different issues, right? Not every jurisdiction has the same problem. So you're looking at a place like Detroit that has a plethora of affordable housing units, but they're all they all need repair, right? So yep. you have those kind of challenges, and then you have challenges in places like Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, where there is no affordable housing, right? So the problems are different, and jurisdictions are trying to navigate all of these different challenges in the face of, dealing with the pandemic and the economic crisis.
I want to dive into how this affects communities of color most acutely. I think you all were talking about systemic racism before that became kind of a more kind of palpable everyday concept over the last few years. One area that you all have been really active is in appraisal bias. So I was just wondering if you could explain the current state and also how appraisals are disproportionately affecting homeowners of color.
Sure. Well, there are now numerous studies that illustrate that appraisal bias is not only real, but that it's systemic. We have research from Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, that show that appraisal bias is real, both in the refinance space and in the homeownership space. According to Brookings, for people who own homes in Black neighborhoods, they are experiencing a cumulative loss of $156 billion in wealth. So that's a lot of lost wealth. And so NAFA is working with numerous stakeholders to address these kinds of challenges. In fact, we co-authored a study commissioned by the Appraisal Subcommittee, which contains numerous recommendations for addressing systemic appraisal bias. We're working with the White House's Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation in order to implement the solutions that they put forward in their action plan. There are a number of solutions that need to be put in place, including increasing diversity in the appraisal industry, developing better training for appraisers so that they understand how to comply with the law, and then bringing on board more technologies that can increase accuracy and consistency in appraisals.
Yeah, I think one area that you have also spoken about is just how people have to remove photographs depicting the race of the homeowners and really kind of strip their homes of identity, which is just so stark. We're coming up on time. I want to make sure we have time for one last question in one area that I also know you've been speaking out about. The Community Reinvestment Act is seeing the most significant changes in a quarter century. The CRA, of course, says banks must meet the overall needs of income levels in their communities. Public comment ends on August 5th, I believe, Friday. So Lisa, tell me what you're watching for here and what you're concerned about in the CRA.
Well, we're concerned that with 40 years of the CRA has not resulted in reducing the racial homeownership gaps. In fact, the Black-white racial homeownership gap is as large today as it was in 1890. The Latino white homeownership gap is as large as it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed over 50 years ago. And that is because one reason is because the CRA doesn't explicitly call for banks to increase their lending in communities of color. So we wanted to see the issue of race and tackling systemic racism elevated in the proposed CRA rule. And as you know, Mitra, the regulators decided to not do that. They're focusing on income as opposed to focusing on race. So we're trying to figure out ways to ensure that the CRA can better elevate dealing with the racial homeownership gap instead of just addressing challenges on income based.
It's something we talk about in our network. URL Media represents 12 Black and Brown media outlets, and we talk all the time about how equity does not mean treating people the same. It means treating people differently to make up for all that you've done to us for centuries. So I really, I do think that's an important point, and I think it's a good one to end on. Lisa Rice, thank you so much for joining Axios and URL Media today. This has been a great conversation. And now back to Axios business reporter, Erica Pandy.
Thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. For more information on fair and equal housing, or to check out our Hard Truths Housing Deep Dive from June, visit axios.com/hard-truths or the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.